This is your host, Jane Hales, and welcome to today's episode of Team Talks, a podcast all about driving transformative growth through innovative and everyday automation solutions. Let's dive in and start to tame your tech today. Get ready to hear the art of making game-changing decisions with Carol Raithatha. Well, I am super excited, Carol. I am so pleased and flattered that you've offered to give me the time so I can learn more about you and more about your journey. You've been one of my best partner suppliers in the past. Whenever I've had a qual job and I thought somebody with big thinking, with attention to detail, and can work in a very good and mature way, you're always top of my list. It's great to have the opportunity to understand more about you as a person. In terms of the journey that got you to where you are, I know that you're not necessarily British born and you have this lovely American accent, but the fact that you also have experience of education in France.
First, thanks, Jane, for those kind words. And you're too flattering. I think I have had a very round career path. It's been something I'm happy about because I've had a lot of different experiences, both in terms of sectors and geography and focus. So coming into research feels really good because I find it so interesting, especially qualitative research, finding out what makes people tick and talking to people is something I really love. But in terms of the career path, I started my undergraduate as a scientist, a food scientist. That was my first degree back in California. I'm from the suburbs of San Francisco, and I went to University of California at Davis, which has a really good food science program. But my first love when I was still at high school was psychology. I really wanted to do psychology, but I thought I wouldn't be able to get a job, which is so crazy when you think about it now. I was pretty good at chemistry, and some idea caught me, and I went and started a degree in chemical engineering.
Wow, that is quite heavy and very scientific. Chemical engineering and food, but psychology was your first love.
Yes. I found out it was not for me, especially the maths. I'm pretty good at maths, but the whole idea of engineering is amazing, but it's not the way I think or I am. Mm-hmm. And luckily, I was doing an elective course in food science, and I really loved that. It had chemistry and some psychology. My mind is jumping about when you say psychology was your first love, and then you did food science. I'm thinking, but food doesn't talk. So what is the connection between non-talking food and psychology? Luckily for me, where I did my course in food science, there was sensory evaluation, which is how people perceive food and drinks. That was really up my street in terms of the psychology, and it just seemed to fit in. Very enjoyable.
Okay, interesting, because I noticed that you used to work in a lab as well. So how was that related to
normal food science? One of the other areas I did was analytical chemistry, working in food analysis labs. And part of that often was the sensory testing. We can do all these chemical or physical tests on food to find out what it contains or does it meet specifications. But we should also get some people to try it out and make sure it is what we think.
Okay.
It's our quality and consistency.
It's a very specialist area. We were working with a team of professional sensory describers. We were testing the softness of toilet tissue. Yes. So we had a lab full of people playing with this toilet paper to describe it in 3 different words. I mean, it's a very complicated area, isn't it?
Yeah, it's quite technical and much more so than people think. I just think, people sitting around tasting some stuff, or as you said, feeling some stuff. But it's quite technical, and there's all the steps involved of screening tasters or training them, calibrating them, and lots of quality checks when they do. Biggest area of sensory, I would say, traditional is the descriptive analysis, which is a technique we're trained assessors develop vocabulary to describe products or stimuli. The point is to quantify the aspects in the language that can be communicated, and then you can compare things.
Okay, that makes sense. So when you were doing that work, would you classify that as a client-side research or on behalf of an agency?
I started client-side, but I also have worked agency-side. I started in British Sugar way back when, and I worked in the research and development team. We actually had a kind of internal unit which provided services to other teams in the business, clients as well. That set me up really well to understand how agency perspective was and client relationship management, in effect.
Must have been interesting. So how did that department sit within the larger organization in terms of its communication, in terms of the support from your relationship and dealing with stakeholders and things like that?
I think that was really good introduction to me to stakeholder management and understanding where different services and knowledge areas fit into a business and what it was trying to do. And luckily for me, I was doing an MBA and the company was sponsoring me. So that also gave me a broader view. It was very practical, and all the assignments were within your organization, and you were solving problems or proposing strategies. And so that really helped me get a broader picture and help the business too. So it was a win-win situation. I'm really grateful looking back.
I'm jealous of you having had that, because I think that's marvellous, that whole business perspective, isn't it? It's not just research for research's sake, but what problems. And when you're starting off in your career, it's difficult to put yourselves in the shoe of the clients to give those impactful, relevant recommendations. What kind of advice would you give to people starting out their career who haven't had the opportunity to do an MBA, for example? How can they get their head into being able to offer good, relevant recommendations for their work?
Yeah, in terms of the mindset, I would completely agree. For me, what's the most important thing is put yourself in the shoes of your client, empathy, get to know why they have come to you. That is really important, isn't it? Sometimes that's lost in all the process. The goal is to help the client address whatever it is. So it's, first of all, listening skills, which is, I think, a theme across my career and my life. Understand the context. Qualitative research is one of the things I do now and I really enjoy. And the other side of what I'm doing is coaching. That's a huge part of coaching too.
Before we go into your coaching, I'd like to step back slightly. So you're obviously doing great work within your organisation, sponsored you to do an MBA, but you've owned your own business for quite some time. What was it that prompted you to create your own business and go freelance rather than stay on the client side?
Well, to be brutally honest, they closed the whole department and I was made redundant. I took on a few roles, but in the end, I felt like a time where everything fit together that I could go independent, knowing that it would give me the opportunity to do new and different things. I have a really unique background, as you said, and the sensory evaluation side of things is a great skill. But I had felt kind of pigeonholed in that because I'm also being the scientist, and I knew I had a lot of other skills.
Interesting. No, because sometimes I know I've looked at the perspective and often hired young people from university and trained them up. So as an industry, what do you think we do well in terms of alternative skill set adopting?
I think from the science perspective, that whole idea about gathering evidence and understanding the stages of how you develop a project or approach an issue within research. But then there's the next step, which is the really interesting, exciting bit. What does that mean? And using your own experience and creativity to apply what we found. Or what does this mean?
So when you started your own company, Who were your first clients? Where did they come from? From starting from nothing, it's the first couple of months are a difficult time, aren't they?
Yeah, really difficult. And at that time, we're talking like 20 years ago, it was very rare and people were a bit wary of this idea as well.
Mm.
Anything remote, I already worked with or I networked with, and actually that's still a huge source of projects for me and clients. I think you need initially a good break. And right after I started, I had 2 projects that were quite big, longer term projects that just kept me going to get into the flow of it. And I was lucky that happened.
Yeah. Oh, that's useful. Having the relationships, executing the project, analysing the project, and then you tend to have that almost flywheel effect. What proportion of your time would you generally say is spent looking for your next piece of work versus actually executing what you've got already?
I probably should spend a lot more time than I do. Probably at least to really keep it taking over. Of course, that's exhausting when you're really busy.
Yeah.
But I do find looking around, understanding different potential client areas, not so much like cold calling or anything, but just things I could offer. Actually, that's the point for me at this point in my career, enjoying the people and things and stimulating and of course making money, but it has to fit into those other things. I mean, the more you get into something, an area, just make contact and start talking to people, things pop up. I think it's so funny. You know how you start to get to know something and then you hear it on the radio, one of your friends mentions something about it, and all of a sudden it's like everywhere.
Yeah.
And it probably was there all the time, but you weren't so focused on it.
That sort of recentness effect, that kind of thing, isn't it? There we are, psychology for you, isn't it? I'm sure there's a proper phrase for that.
Yeah.
Talking of things that are interesting, you mentioned earlier that you've gone into coaching, so that's a new part of your journey. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, I would say that's one of the pivotal moments in my career to decide to do that. I was doing some mentoring as a volunteer and realizing that the listening skills I developed from qualitative research really helped in mentoring. And then I looked into coaching and I thought, oh, this is something I'd really enjoy and I think I'd be pretty good. And it complements the roles I already have. So I did a coaching course. I just really enjoyed it. The whole idea about coaching is you're really trying a lot of the time not to offer advice, and that can be hard, but it's so powerful to empower people, providing a structure for people to explore what they want to focus on. I'm doing coaching within a professional context. What is it about their career or their current role, future that they want to, where do they want to set targets or objectives? Yeah. Part of the coaching is that. It sounds like it should be obvious, but it's often the hardest part to get people to reflect enough to really have something that's meaningful to them, helping them to work up their own plans for moving from A to B. And that feeling, even though I say before people start, I'm not really going to give you advice. After the first couple of sessions, they're like, oh, wow, that's really amazing. I started there and then I thought this and then I came up with this and now I have these things I can go and do and I know that I've got these strengths, and you hardly said anything. That is the skill, isn't it? Making a hard job look easy through directing people, nudging them without feeling as though they're being hit around the head and finding the answers themselves. Well done. Once in a while I do jump in with some advice because it doesn't seem fair to go on 2 sessions and not just put it into the ring and say, well, have you thought about this? Then that's up to them. So it sounds as though it's sort of career coaching that you're specializing in. Is that the case? Is that what you call it? Yeah, most of what I've been doing so far is within the workplace. It could be with a kind of agency side or client side, and I'm focusing on people in the research area.
Yeah.
So agency side or client side, that it's being offered to people within the organization as part of their PDP. So they might have training, what I'm offering focus in a certain topic area.
Yeah.
What the coach decides at the first pre-session and first session, and then the rest focus on that.
Interesting. I know this might be a difficult question to answer publicly, but what proportion of your mentees stay in the job that they started in after you've coached them?
Probably because a lot of them are younger. It's been 4/5 maybe to a fifth that within the time scale, or not even within a year or two after.
Yeah.
So the turnover is already quite high. Sometimes it does make you aware that what you're doing and the organization you're doing it in really aren't.
From a personal perspective, I find that quite reassuring, because when I've done coaching with people in the industry, my first 2 mentees decided to leave their jobs within 6 months. You're thinking, I'm not sure this is why they were encouraged to do it, but I think the purpose of doing it is finding something that excites you, something you're going to be good at, in a place where you're going to be happy and that shares your values. And there is a fine balance between I've had to flex a lot over the last couple of years, making sure that part is right before you worry about getting the job done, making sure there's the right fit and they're happy doing it, because we're a service industry, aren't we? So.
Yeah, I agree with you. For an organization too, if they have an employee that isn't happy, it's not good for them, is it? It doesn't feel like it sometimes at the time, but usually longer term, it's a win-win thing.
Yeah. The agencies you're coaching for, largely the people that have also used you for your qualitative research skills as well. So I guess trusted in your hands.
That's a theme that I've been doing consulting, and it's mostly word of mouth connections.
The importance of relationships, indeed. Yeah. We use different lenses in research to look at the same data. Looking at your clients from delivering a qualitative service to delivering a mentoring service, that must be interesting, the sort of slight flip. Have you learned a different perspective of your...
Yeah, there definitely is a flip, because you start to think about things in a different way and hear different things. Mm-hmm. You have different limitations on what you share, obviously, because the actual coaching...
Yeah.
Confidential between me and the coachee. But yes, I would say it is different. I found it's a benefit because I know what kind of work they do, what the culture's like, and even some of the vocabulary people use, which can save time when you're in the coaching relationship. So we walk the tightrope. If I become too much like part of that organization, then I can't really have the same kind of relationship. They need that sort of objectivity, and I need it too. And it's just being familiar enough, but not really being part of that.
Interesting. Do you have any tips or little tools for keeping yourself in check in terms of how much you go into the client's role versus keeping yourself independent? Do you notice any particular behaviors in yourself or the clients where you think, okay, now I need to step back and be more independent?
From the kind of more pure consultancy point of view, when you're not bringing in anything new to them.
Yes. Okay.
I hope to be bringing some new ways of thinking, because that's the benefit of using me. I've worked for lots of different companies, so I've seen lots of different ways of organizing and doing things. I've got time to look around and read up on new areas and new methodologies or new technologies.
Yeah, that makes sense. An example of a time where you felt you've almost become your client and you needed to step back. I mean, one example I have of myself, and I was laughing with a friend this weekend, was that I worked for Kimberly-Clark for many years in the away from home division. We'd done research on the shape of the dispensers, and the horseshoe shapes and the square shapes and where you get the dust in and this, that and the other. And then I find myself going into every public toilet looking at the brand of toilet paper dispenser, hand towel dispenser, and you're thinking, hang on, I just need to calm down a bit. I don't need to be worried about what public washrooms is.
I do that all the time, especially I work for some food and drink companies. You can get really involved. It's a new formulation and then it's out there, but in fact, it's their thing.
This is nice to have that pride, isn't it? That shared. I was involved with that. I think that's a really interesting point, because in the MRS conference last week, current president Georgina White, one of her comments was about interviewing new recruits and the CVs there with the methodology and bits and pieces. But the part of the conversation that people find more difficult as researchers is talking about the impact that their work has had. Because often you do a project and then you disappear, don't you? Any advice you might give to people trying to assess the impact that you've had from your work?
I think it's an issue. First of all, ask.
We are professional askers, so you're quite right. Why not ask?
I'd like to know how did that help? How did that end up? Also, keeping an eye on sectors or product types, or seeing how it's moving versus what you thought from those projects. That can be a really good and rewarding thing to do. A lot of times, I just don't know what's happened. I've done some advertising projects which I didn't find out with that. So I'm trying to watch ads and which one did they go with, or...
Yeah, that's really interesting. That almost takes us back to where we started at the beginning, in terms of psychology was your favourite subject, but you didn't know or didn't think you could make a living out of that. Who did you go to get a second opinion on what psychology would have done for you as a career?
I don't really know if I went to anyone, which is part of the problem. I mean, I think they were called counsellors, which isn't the same way we use the word here in the UK. In the US, in school, you had a counsellor who was like a careers advisor. I really don't remember ever going to see those people, so I have no idea. I was 17, so that's pretty young. One thing I did want to say, when you first brought up that area where I started like a scientist, I do believe that everyone makes their role or their job fit what they want to do as much as possible. So, for example, I always wanted to do psychology. So within food science, I ended up going towards this psychology end of things. People do that all the time in different jobs and roles. They have a core area that they like or feel comfortable in, and they develop that because it's natural to them, or they pursue those lines.
Yeah, that's almost like your sweet spot. You knew and you managed to gravitate towards it.
Often subconscious as well, but obviously if you become more aware of your motivations, you can have clearer intent. This is back like a coaching conversation.
That's fine.
You can have clear intentions. Sometimes it doesn't mean that you have to leave an organization or change your job. It can be just use the freedom that you've already got to make that job something that you really like.
Yes, that phrase, intentionality. Have a bit of a plan. I think you're quite right. I know we mentioned that in EO. You mentioned insight synthesis you've been working on. What does that mean, please? Insight synthesis. It sounds exciting.
I did a couple of projects the last 2 years or so that were similar. And when I got asked to do a talk just last week for the Anglia Ruskin University Festival of Consumer Sciences, I thought, well, I can talk about this. I called it Repurpose Your Insights. So the whole idea to me is it's really focused on maybe bigger client side, although you can apply some of this to agency roles. I work for some quite big corporations, and they buy in a lot of research and have a lot of information just floating around, but they rarely look at that before they commission more research.
Yeah.
So understanding what you've got, thinking, what is it we want to know from that information? And why is it to direct future research? Is it to get some inspiration to take us in new directions? For example, there may be a lot of research over the last 2 years where the focus was on young men, but you now are interested in young women. If you go back and at least get some initial idea about that.
Yeah, if you've spoken to both genders, the chances are that there's information in there. Repurpose what you've got.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean that you stop. You want to know something in particular. You want to plan your research for the next 6 months. Then long term, have a better system to document or record somehow what is important about different projects. Be able to access that quickly, sharing as well, like different people, different silos, knowing what other people have done. One of the things I said is finding relevant information is much harder than you think, even though it's all within an organization. And that's kind of crazy too.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on frameworks or tools that could help with the identifying the right question, storing the information and emanating it to the right people?
So far, I have applied a reasonably low-tech approach, although some of my clients have used their own management information systems to locate information. But I do think AI can be used in various ways in this whole process, from finding things to how you store them and access them, to summarizing things from past research.
I agree. So you're definitely camp AI's improvement as opposed to AI is taking my job then?
Oh yeah, I think it might take some of my job, but that's the way life is. Other things took some of my job. I mean,
yeah,
just transcription and things like that. And you can't hold things back.
No, that makes sense. Is there any other bits of your job you want it to take that it hasn't taken yet?
I haven't reflected on that, Jay.
That's okay. Don't worry.
No.
Don't worry. Keeping us in the sweet spot of what we're good at and getting rid of the stuff we don't want, isn't it? If AI can do that, that's great. If a person can do that, that's great as well, isn't it?
Yeah, one thing I just think about AI is I do hope it doesn't make us forget, like, our job is to listen to people. But, you know, if you're doing market research, your job is to listen to people, or behavioral psychology, like how does it affect people's motivations and therefore how they behave?
Yeah. Interesting. We need to keep an eye on them. I think coming back to your point about adapting and changing to meet the environment as things develop, we need to develop. But we're hardwired for many things societally, culturally, aren't we? We possibly don't change as quick as the computers, but got to keep your eye out for that. Talking about looking back and reflecting. Brilliant. Thank you, Carol. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed this. I have learned more about you. You're a great person anyway, and even more interesting now. So thank you so much for your time. So thank you for joining us for this episode of Team Talks today. We hope you found that aha moment to help you on your journey towards automation and business growth. Don't forget to subscribe in the link below and tune in next time where we'll explore. Till then, remember to tame your tech and keep pushing those boundaries.